Pre-poll voting starts today. So where is this election at right now? We told you where things were at the outset. How much have they changed? Let's begin looking at the two-party preferred on the latest news poll. We saw April 18, so when the campaign was beginning, 53-47. That was a significant tightening, though, from 55-45 only a couple of surveys ago. What's happened since then? Not much initially. The last two polls, even though there was a bit of a stumble from Anthony Albanese, not much change. And in fact, today's one, 54-46. So significant advantage right now to Labor. The caveat with all of this, both sides are saying plenty of soft vote in this. That is, people that are voting Labor for now that have not entirely made up their mind. And both sides put this overall result a bit closer. But this is the published poll, 54-46. What's it looking like in primary? Let's bring that up then. And this has seen a little bit more change going on. Let's just focus on the two majors for now. We'll talk a bit more about the other parties going forward. But 36-35 for Labor. As we see this come to three surveys later, the coalition's still on 35, but Labor up to 39. That does not mean they can't win the election on 36 in terms of that primary. It just means the higher their primary is, the less they're going to have to rely on minor parties and preferences. And you've seen the Greens come down one, bit of a change in the other vote. But that primary vote there, the story of this has been a growing, slowly growing Labor primary vote. Preferred PM has been bouncing around a bit more, though. This is an interesting measure because Tony Abbott won it before he came to power. So did Kevin Rudd. So will Anthony Albanese. We saw here on March 13, 42 all, and people said finally he's levelling this measure up. Is this him gaining momentum? After that, we saw Scott Morrison come out and establish a very strong lead, 44-39 and then 46-37. So a big gap did open up. And that was perhaps, did we see there Anthony Albanese's stumbles coming through, and would that then go into two-party preferred and primary? Well, instead, we've seen this measure narrow again significantly, 44-42. So it is now credible that Anthony Albanese could actually win that measure ahead of an election day. Only one poll ago or two polls ago, you'd say no way. So that's been bouncing around a lot. Net satisfaction, very interesting as well. So this is the overall number of voters that approve of Scott Morrison versus disapprove. As you can see, he's not changing here much, from -14 to -14. That's from March 13 to May 9. Anthony Albanese has seen a significant change, though, from +2, and you can see his lead there on Scott Morrison significant, down to -6. So this has narrowed a lot. Some of the people getting to know Anthony Albanese during this campaign haven't liked him. This would be encouragement. This is what the coalition's trying to do, albeit Scott Morrison remains unpopular. They don't think he'll be the popular candidate on the day the PM said that, but they want to close this gap as much as possible. What's interesting as well is how this compares to 2019. So let's bring that up. And what Bill Shorten was for the Labor Party. Scott Morrison in 2019 was -1, so a lot more popular. So he is a lot less popular now. That's not news. But it is worth remembering, this is the same point in the campaign in 2019. That's when we're getting this measure. Bill Shorten was -18. Labor in that election lost, but it was 51.5 versus 48.5 two-party preferred. It wasn't a massacre. And they got close-ish, even with Bill Shorten, very unpopular. So it's just worth noting that Labor come off a very low base in terms of net satisfaction to the leader last time compared to this time. When we're looking as well at news poll two-party preferred, how does that compare? Again, at this same point, less than 2 weeks to go in the campaign. At that point, even though Labor were hot favourites, they were only up 51-49. Again, today's is 54-46. So yes, there's a caveat on polls. They were wrong last time. They'd have to be a lot more wrong this time, or there has to be a severe tightening to see a similar result happen. So it's worth looking at that result as well. And how are things playing out on the uniform swing? Now, we're always wary of this. We know things don't happen in a uniform sense, and we'll break down seats in a moment. But how that would happen right now in a uniform swing, and the state of the parliament at that 54-46 news poll scenario does show that this would be a victory for Labor. So 54-46, you see the coalition go from 76 down to 59, Labor at 86. Look, nobody from either side is predicting this result right now, but it does just show the power of that 54-46, that it wouldn't really be a seat-by-seat proposition if this were replicated on the actual day. What about hung parliament? That's spoken about a lot, perhaps less today, but we have heard a lot about it. How would a hung parliament happen, importantly in this election, with the current electoral pendulum? If the two parties are very close together on 2PP, is the biggest factor. We are giving 6 seats to the crossbench. That could grow, but even if it stays at 6, the point of them being very close together on 2PP is that means they would be very close together on seats, i.e. take out the 6 from the crossbench. How does one party get to 76? With a lot of difficulty. So that's worth remembering right there. But what if Labor's ahead? If Labor's ahead and they're losing a bit of primary to the Greens, the only thing that would matter for Labor there really is, are any of those Greens votes turning into Greens seats? Now, right now, the likelihood is no. That could be a possibility in southeast Queensland. But with a Labor solid lead, 52, 53 of two-party preferred, we're unlikely to see seats go to the Greens. And that means you don't need to worry so much about Labor's primary. On the other hand, if the coalition gets right back into the game at 50-50, there would still be a prospect even then that independents pick up some of the seats, the so-called teal candidates. So on the Labor side, if they've got a solid win, you don't get too worried about the primary. On the Liberal side, it is a bit more of a factor because the independents are more likely to pick up their seats than Labor are the Green seats. So in other words, this final point here, there's no magic number on primary vote. The higher you are, the better it is, the less you rely on preferences. But Labor can lose a couple on the primary from their current high polling and still get that majority. Why do I say that? Let's bring up the primary vote right now versus that 2019 result. Look at 2019, the coalition on 41, now they're on 35. So losing 6%. The crucial question is, where does that 6% go? Now, of that latest poll, it's all going to Labor. In other words, Labor doesn't have to be too concerned about making sure they gain that coalition vote via other preferences. But even if Labor loses a couple here, then the question does become, how much will Labor have to rely on preferences to get a majority? So it's not so much this needing to be a specific figure, but the lower that is, the more Labor relies on preferences from here. From the Greens, they get them at 80%. What about these other voters, though? Where are they likely to head? Well, let's bring up what's happened at the last two elections on those preferences, where preference flows have actually gone in those elections to give us a bit of indication, because there are some interesting things happening here. The Greens vote, when we bring that up, if we can bring that up right now, that's been quite steady in terms of the extent that that's gone to the Labor Party. The Greens vote, as you can see, 81.9 in 2016, 82.2. So very steady. How much of that vote goes back to Labor if someone doesn't vote for Labor or the coalition number one? What's more interesting is 2016, 49.2. This is every other party other than the Greens and where their preferences go. In 2019, that's dropped nearly 6%, 43.7. There was a big campaign against Labor, remember, last time around, particularly from United Australia Party. This time around, you've got UAP and Pauline Hanson's One Nation, more generally incumbents rather than necessarily anti-Labor. That's particularly the case for UAP, and that's how advertising is running. If we see this return to something like this, you're talking about a 1% bounce on two-party preferred for Labor. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if polls are 51 to 49 and they're based on last preference flows, but the preference flows go back to 2016, suddenly it's more like 52-48. So this is significant. It doesn't mean that's going to happen, but this feels like potential upside for Labor on those preference flows. So that's worth factoring as well when you're thinking about who might be able to form a majority government. Just going through some scenarios, and this is again talking about universal flows and how that would happen and affect the House, because we are expecting the contest to tighten. So let's have a look at some of those possibilities right now. At 52-48, and this is a strong possibility, both sides think this is where it becomes a seat-by-seat proposition for Labor. But at 76 to 69, yes, it might not necessarily happen that way. The point about this is Labor's not assured a majority at 52-48, even though it's a strong result for them. The coalition probably out of the conversation of any form of government at that level. At 51-49, then you're getting into that hung parliament territory. So Labor at 72, coalition 73. That can change. Once you're getting this close, you're talking about a whole lot of seats. It will be very close margins. If they go either way, it puts one of those in the box seat to at least be in minority government, if not majority. And at 50-50, you'd have to say, even though that feels like a pretty close result, the coalition would be more of a chance at that point of sandbagging more of those seats they need to hang on to. So even though that feels like a nil-all draw on those particular numbers, the coalition would at that point start to feel better about at least forming minority government and maybe even getting to majority. So that's the state of the House and how those various swings play out. What about election winning odds? Yes, we know the last time the polls weren't accurate and maybe the odds weren't as well. We know they weren't. But it's worth tracking because down here, just after the election, you've got a Labor, slight underdogs, and then blowing right out. It's not that long ago, February 21, Labor $3.50, the coalition $1.28. That was the height of Scott Morrison's popularity. The pandemic managed pretty well, coming right in by November last year to equal favourites, and then the coalition blowing out, a poor summer, not enough vaccines at various points, not enough rapid antigen tests, and from there you saw Labor have a solid lead all the way up to just after the election started. Early Anthony Albanese stumbles and back to $1.90 each, but since then, with the polling stagnant for the coalition seemingly, or perhaps a perception that voters weren't actually changing their minds, the campaign wasn't having an effect yet. Perhaps, we'll see. The point is the money's gone to Labor. So it's worth keeping an eye on. It's not the holy grail, but it is worth keeping an eye on those particular odds. What about hung parliament and whether there will be a hung parliament? I spoke to you about the prospect of that. Look, the more those polls narrowed from November 21 right here to 9th of April, you saw the hung parliament chance increased. At this point, $1.55 people are saying no, $2.35 yes. So still people think there'll be a majority. If the polls tighten, those odds will tighten. And that does make sense, the money flowing in that particular way. Looking at the national map, and we brought this to you last time, and some of the focus here has narrowed a bit. So 2 to 3 ALP, look, it's probably more in the range of 2 now. 1 to 2 ALP, probably more in the range of 1. But broadly speaking, the equation's the same. How many can Labor pick up in WA, South Australia, in Queensland? 1 possible to the NT, obviously not a huge battleground. But then what happens in these states? Victoria and Tasmania, not going to see a huge number of seats flow in those particular states. They can go either way. What this tells you is, again, and still, it's all coming down to New South Wales. Even if things go really well for Labor in those states, and perhaps they even pick up 1 or 2 here, they're going to be perhaps getting to a majority there of 76. At that point, they still need to perform well in New South Wales. They can't afford to lose net seats in New South Wales, or at best, they're in minority government. Same applies for the government here. Maybe things go really well. Maybe they lose 1 in WA, maybe none in Queensland, South Australia. Maybe they even level up the score overall in Victoria and Tasmania, so they come to New South Wales having lost in those seats. Well, they still need to perform well. It's still a state that could have a whole bunch of seats go each way. So what this tells you still is it all comes through New South Wales for the overall result of the election. Breaking that out into seats, let's go around the country. There are some interesting developments coming in. Perth, first of all, is interesting. Look, Labor's ambitions here are more like 2 than 3 now. They're quite confident of Swan. They're feeling very good about Pearce. 2 seats where the incumbent is stepping down. But the coalition, the Liberal Party, believes they're more in the battle in Pearce than when they were. So there's a bit of disagreement, if you like, about Pearce. Hasluck is an interesting one because you've got an incumbent, Ken Wyatt, but about a third of the voters here have never voted for him or an opponent before. There have been boundary redistributions in Perth that are affecting a whole lot of different seats. And for that reason, Hasluck, I think it's still in play, but Labor is talking down its prospects a little bit. They'll be trying as hard as they can. The point about Perth overall, I think we're talking more about the likelihood of 2 changing hands. Do keep an eye on Curtin, big margin, but it's talking about another Teal candidate there. Can they perhaps capture that zeitgeist or capitalise on it? Let's turn our attention to Adelaide. Look, perhaps in the wake of that election result, in the state result, people thought Sturt would go. Nobody's talking about that now. All roads lead to Boothby. Too hard to make a call on it. I think it's fair to say Labor just ahead at the moment, but that seat is still going to be a huge battleground. So just 1 in Adelaide. Northern Territory, similar. We spoke about that last time. Lingiari is the seat here up for grabs. As you can see, this is basically the rest of the state. Solomon takes in Darwin. The key here, you've still got that incumbent stepping down. Warren Snowden not contesting. We won't know that seat until election night. It's just too hard to get a reading on that in terms of polling. Brisbane, as we head to Queensland now, so the Liberal Party here has an interesting proposition ahead of it in Brisbane. What's it going to do in some of these seats? Now, there is a bit of disagreement coming in around Brisbane, I must say. That both parties agree Longman is just dropping down the list a bit in terms of likelihood to change hands, so the Liberal Party feeling better about that. Labor is feeling better about Brisbane, though, and Ryan to a degree as well. So Ryan's gone up the list of potential changes, and Ryan is, well, by the way, a potential for a good Greens vote there. We don't think Greens will get more seats, but it's a possibility, and if it happens, probably South East Queensland. So Brisbane, put that up the list a bit, Longman down a little bit. What about Labor in Brisbane? This is where you're getting more disagreement between the 2 parties on what might happen, because we've got a lot of seats here with some small margins. Griffith is one to watch for the Greens. Labor still feels like it's hanging on to it. The Greens putting every effort into Griffith. Lilly, it won't go. Small margin, but don't worry about it. The candidate having huge problems as well for the LNP anyway. Morton will be a hold. The confidence is there for the Labor Party on that. And Blair's a really interesting one. Look at the size of it. This is one of the big debates of this campaign between Labor and Liberal right now behind the scenes. The government is adamant. This sort of seat, out of suburban, part of it regional, is anti-lockdown, hasn't liked the state Labor governments all that much. They don't care about social issues. They're backing the coalition on the economy and defence. Labor adamant this is still Labor heartland, and they think it will go towards the Labor Party in this election. So Blair's an interesting watch. I'm not saying that it will change hands, but if it's true, if the government's picking up that sentiment, will we see a swing in Blair, or is this not so much a threat? And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Regional Queensland, not a huge battleground in this area. Leichhardt is the seat that's at the most danger of falling here for the coalition. A little bit of divergence there because Labor thinks Warren Ench, the sitting MP, might have been a bit of a stale candidate. The government adamant Ench will be the one delivering them that seat back. Don't worry about Dawson, Capricornia or Herbert. Flynn's interesting. Labor doesn't think this will change hands. They were hopeful a few months ago, but they are putting everything into it. They need hope in the regions. You've got to trim some of these margins perhaps if you're going to win them next time around. So Flynn you might call a 2025 project as to whether that changes hands. On to the next two biggest states. So Victoria first of all, and within the city there of Melbourne. What's interesting about this is, in the main part, the teal effect I'll talk about in a moment. Chisholm feels like line ball. It's probably a must-win for Labor if they're going to be positive in Victoria, because look at the margin. We keep talking about the seat each time. Liberal Party doing everything it can to hold it, so that's a very hotly contested seat. Casey is a watch on the margin. You've got Tony Smith standing down. Nobody thinks Deakin will move. Higgins, another interesting one, because Katie Allen running for a second time. The government feels that puts them in a strong position. Labor says it got the margin crimped down last time. They think they're in play, so a bit of divergence there. What we do agree on is Kooyong and Goldstein, both massive watches. Now, that teal impact is another one. Is it real? Is it going to last to election day? The government feels as though perhaps we're getting the peak of teal support now or even a week ago. The teal candidates feel as though they're surfing momentum. We'll see Goldstein a few weeks ago was not being put up as a genuine chance of changing. It is now. So momentum certainly has been there. And Kooyong, what else can you say about it other than we've never seen so much money spent, I don't think, in one electorate in the history of Australian politics. In terms of the Labor seats as well here, there is agreement that Corangamite is in play. And that is one that's going to have everything thrown at it by both sides. So that's one to watch. That's just outside of Melbourne, so we're talking Geelong area. Dunkley, Labor feeling much better about, and the government concedes Labor should do so. So Labor feeling better about Dunkley. Corangamite is going to be in. McEwen's just up here as well. That's another interesting one. Contested as to whether that's an outer suburb seat that Labor's really vulnerable in, or whether the government can win it. It's about a 5% margin. But the biggest battle is going to be New South Wales, as I mentioned, and a few different areas to look at. Northern Beaches, first of all. So once upon a time, Warringah was going to come back to the government. It won't now. Wentworth, Liberal Party feeling better about that, but there's a little bit of uncertainty. It's right in play, and we've got, of course, Allegra Spender up against Dave Sharma there. Hughes is an interesting watch, of course. We've got Craig Kelly, who was the member, an independent standing, so I think it'll be a watch rather than one I'm expecting to go. North Sydney will be the one the most concern is held for the Liberal Party in terms of teal candidates in Sydney. Look, it's an interesting contest. It's a three-way one for Trent Zimmerman. I think it's right on the watch list if it's a bit hard to say whether it will fall or not. We don't have a reference point. We haven't had this sort of contest for North Sydney before, so it makes it hard to figure out where we're tracking. Mackellar, the margin looking pretty high there, as you can see. Internal polling suggests the Liberal Party will be okay in that one. So that's Northern Beaches. Hunter, very different. This is Labor on the defence in the Hunter region. Think Coles seats here as well. The biggest chance of falling, a lot of conversations with both sides. It's a bit hard to figure this area out, but 3% is the margin, and that's the seat the Nationals are targeting. So they're going to put everything they can into Hunter, and that, I think, makes it the most hotly contested one. Labor, perhaps some comments there on what the future of coal mines is, might endanger them a little bit. We'll see. But Hunter probably the biggest chance from Patterson and then Shortland. These are three seats that had swings against the Labor Party last time. The problem as to them actually falling is they saw the swings last time. They've changed their approach. They've changed some of their rhetoric as well, Labor. So they feel like they can fend off this concern. Nobody from the government is saying one of these will fall with a lot of confidence, but they're hopeful, and they're definitely having a crack in Hunter. So it's worth watching for that particular reason. Central Coast, interesting battle coming up here. You've got two seats next to each other, very similar seats, and we've got one held by the government by 4.2%, one by Labor by 1.5%. So perhaps where one goes, they both go. You've got incumbency as the factor on each side of things. A little bit hard to see what's going on here exactly, but if you listen to the two parties, Dobell, Labor feels a bit better about. They admit it's in play. Robertson has just gone slightly down the order on whether or not it will fall. So the government feeling a little bit better about the seat of Robertson on the Central Coast. Then we get to Western Sydney. So let's look at two different areas of Western Sydney, or two different seats, if you like. in terms of whether it's Labor or Liberal. From the Labor side, Parramatta. Bit of disagreement on the two sides. This is similar to Blair. It is in play. Both sides agree on that. Labor feels as though it should still be ahead and feels okay about holding the seat. The Liberal Party is throwing everything at this, and they feel like Andrew Charlton, the parachuted-in candidate, is vulnerable. We'll see. Greenway might make sense on paper in the margin. I'm just not sure the Liberal candidate is going to be able to unseat Labor's sitting MP there, so we'll see. Macquarie, you can see a small margin, but both sides believe that the overall factors here, including flooding and the flood response, should mean Labor hold on to that. So this is not a huge concern for Labor, but a watch considering the type of voters we're talking about. On the Liberal side, this is interesting as well. So Lindsay, remember, of course, change hands, went to the Liberal Party last time. No one's talking about it shifting, so Labor not able to wrest that back. Reid, though, is seen as the surest gain for Labor in the state. They're feeling very good about that and nothing's changed. Banks is an interesting watch around the vote there and perhaps including a bit of the Chinese vote, and whether that might hurt the government. Bennelong's another one. It's not on this map, but Bennelong in Sydney is considered Labor's second best chance of gaining a seat now. That's changed. That's gone up the list. So Bennelong is an interesting one to watch. You've got John Alexander, of course, stepping down. So they're the seats. That's how it's happening across the country. How does it play out from here for a Labor victory, first of all? What are their factors? Win enough seats outside New South Wales. They've got to make up ground outside New South Wales. They've got positive reasons to do so, and that just has to happen. Minimal net loss in New South Wales, or really gains. I mean, they don't want to go back in New South Wales. Ideally, they'd pick up seats in New South Wales. They certainly can't afford for it to go badly. A better economic message, so they need to make sure voters are listening to them, and it's not just about health for Labor. They need people to believe they're going to have a good handle on inflation and cost of living. They can't rely on just their so-called traditional strengths. And of course, public dislike of Scott Morrison. So making it as much a referendum about Scott Morrison as possible is clearly the Labor tactic. We haven't seen a huge number of new policies put down for that reason. They think that's their strength. What about the coalition and how they might win from here? Obviously, they're behind, and it would be minimising losses in WA, South Australia and Queensland. So how low can they make that go is the big question. Queensland, maybe it's 0. South Australia and WA, maybe 1 in total. That would be a fantastic result for them. A net gain of seats in Tassie and Vic. They don't need to sweep up these, and you can add NT in there as well, but can they be on the positive side of the ledger overall and maybe even count that? And then, yes, we're saying this again, but New South Wales, that being where it all comes back to. A general mood in New South Wales, and it might be a little bit region to region, but a general mood in New South Wales for either side really is a huge advantage. And again, where this election comes back to, whether it's minority or majority, New South Wales will be the one area we'll look at the most on the night. And of course, sticking with the devil, you know, he's not pretending he's popular. He's not trying to say that, but this is the government hoping that this uncertainty of times eventually gets voters back to them. And this is one thing you're hearing a lot from both sides. There's a soft vote out there. People are yet to firmly make up their mind. What will they do in the last 2 weeks? People vote from today, and they'll be voting in the biggest numbers on May 21. So what are the final 2 weeks, or a bit short of that in the campaign about? This is the issue right now for the Liberal Party. 2 lots of sandbagging. First of all, v Labor, and that's right across the country, as we saw. WA, South Australia, Queensland. So different messages, but the same one broadly is that they're trying to get or make sure Labor doesn't win seats off it. So that's one problem. And the other one, sandbagging versus the Teals. It's hard to get a read, as I said. Some of these seats haven't had these types of contests before. We might be talking about 4 seats going on the night, or maybe none. It could really be both of those outcomes in terms of new Teal candidates on the scenes there. But that's a different type of sandbagging. It's around progressive politics. It's around National Integrity Commission. It's about climate. And that's what makes the hardest task ahead for the coalition, that they need to do 2 types of sandbagging there, if you like. Labor sandbagging versus the Liberals, and this is what I was talking about earlier. The biggest disagreement that's emerging in my conversations with the two sides is Labor really and properly vulnerable in those seats we were talking about, in Melbourne and around Victoria, in Queensland, in some of the southeast, in New South Wales, in Western Sydney in particular, and even the Hunter. Are they vulnerable? Are there people that are worried and didn't like lockdowns under state Labor governments? Are there people sick of progressive social issues? Or is that a bit overblown? Is that something the Liberal Party's hoping will be a self-fulfilling prophecy? That question, if you could answer that right now, you'd know whether or not the Liberal Party's any chance of forming government, because if there's nothing happening there at all, it just becomes very hard for them to do all that sandbagging and then still perhaps make some gains on that side there. And where do the soft votes break? this is still crucial. Yes, we saw a pretty significant two-party preferred and primary, but within that, there are soft votes. There are people that could still switch, and both sides are saying it's a higher soft vote than we've seen at previous elections. It's a longer campaign, and what that might have actually meant is people knew they could just tune it in at the end. So, yes, you'd rather be Labor right now with that lead, but that soft vote is still going to be crucial. Just finally, leaving with this notion as well, what will we know on the night is interesting, because perhaps if there's a really strong result, and that's more likely to happen for Labor, we'll have a result on the night. But postal votes is really interesting, because last time around, the postal votes, the total we had was 1.5 million in the entire election. So 1.5 million postal votes. 1.97 was the figure on Saturday of ballots requested. We know not all of them will be used, but that's ballots requested. And we've still got the opportunity to request ballots until next Wednesday. In other words, there will be a massive number of postal votes, a record number, and a much higher percentage. And that could mean there are quite a number of seats that are undecided on the night, because you just won't have the certainty. Why? Well, first of all, more postal votes in a seat means a greater percentage. But are we getting new people postal voting for the first time? I.e., last time it's easy enough to see this is where the postal vote split, coalition versus Labor. If there are new people voting that way, maybe those numbers change. So for that reason, we're going to be a bit more cautious around calling seats when those postal votes are a factor. So that's where we're at. Less than 2 weeks to go. We said at the start the campaign would matter, even though there is a decent lead to Labor, and you'd rather be the Labor Party right now. Given the soft vote in particular, the rest of the campaign will still matter as well.